What if the most shocking royal story of the decade didn't come from a palace press release, but from a whisper that spread faster than the truth could catch up? Think about that for a second. Not a confirmed statement, not an official document, not even a named source. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just a claim, a rumor, a headline screaming urgency. 5 minutes ago. And suddenly, the internet did what it always does when emotion beats evidence. It panicked. Because when the name Prince Harry enters the conversation, nothing is ever simple. And when children are mentioned, emotions skyrocket. Logic fades. Questions multiply. And before anyone stops to ask, is this real? Millions are already asking something far more dangerous. What if it is? This is not a story about confirmed DNA results. This is not a declaration of fact. This is a story about how a rumor, unchecked, emotionally charged, and algorithmically amplified, became powerful enough to make people believe they were watching a man's world collapse in real time. And why that matters more than the rumor itself. Because right now, at this exact moment, there are people who genuinely believe Prince Harry just discovered something devastating about his own family. They believe it because they saw it framed as breaking news. They believe it because it fits a narrative they've already accepted. And they believe it because the internet doesn't reward patience, it rewards outrage. So let me ask you something directly. When was the last time you saw a viral royal headline and stopped to ask who benefits from you believing it? That question sits at the heart of this entire story. The timing alone is suspicious. Prince Harry is already one of the most psychologically analyzed public figures on Earth. A man permanently caught between privilege and pain, between royal duty and personal rebellion, between the family he was born into and the life he tried to build outside of it. Every chapter of his adult life has been lived under a microscope. His mother's death, his role as the spare, his decision to walk away from royal life, his marriage, his interviews, his books, his lawsuits, each moment layered with judgment, assumption, and endless interpretation. So when an explosive claim appears, one that attacks the very core of identity, family, and fatherhood, it doesn't land in a neutral space. It lands on dry grass. And the spark doesn't need proof to ignite. It only needs emotion. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. Stories like this don't go viral because they're accurate. They go viral because they feel believable. And belief, once triggered, becomes self-reinforcing. Think about how this particular rumor is framed. It doesn't say sources claim. It doesn't say unverified reports. It doesn't say online speculation. It says urgency. It says finality. It says devastation. And most importantly, it suggests secrecy. Because nothing pulls people in faster than the idea that they're seeing something they weren't meant to see. A hidden truth. A leaked revelation. A moment behind closed doors. That framing is deliberate. And it works. Within minutes, reactions flood social media. Some sympathetic, some cruel, some analytical. Many already convinced. Comment sections turn into courtrooms. Strangers become judges. And Prince Harry, once again, becomes less of a person and more of a symbol. A symbol of betrayal. A symbol of humiliation. A symbol of, I always knew something was off. But let's slow this down. Because before we even touch the claim itself, we have to ask a far more important question. Why was the world so ready to believe it? To understand that, we have to understand the emotional context surrounding Harry right now. This is a man who has spent his entire life grappling with identity. Not just public identity, but personal identity. Who am I without the crown? Who am I without the institution? Who am I without the protection and the control of the monarchy? Harry has openly spoken about feeling lost, about struggling with purpose, about questioning the systems that raised him, about the emotional damage caused by constant scrutiny. And here's where things get complicated. When someone publicly acknowledges vulnerability, the world doesn't always respond with compassion. Sometimes it responds by pushing harder, by testing that vulnerability, by seeing how far it can bend before it breaks. So when a rumor suggests that even Harry's role as a father, arguably the one identity he clings to most fiercely, is under threat, it hits harder than any political scandal ever could. Because this isn't about titles or money. It's about belonging. And belonging is the one thing Harry has been searching for his entire life. Now, ask yourself this. If you already believe Harry is emotionally fragile, if you already believe his life has been chaotic, if you already believe his decisions have been impulsive, doesn't this rumor feel like it fits? That's how misinformation works. It doesn't introduce something completely foreign. It attaches itself to what you already think you know. And suddenly, the story feels familiar, almost inevitable. But familiarity is not evidence. And emotion is not proof. Yet online, those distinctions vanish. Within hours, speculation mutates. People analyze old photos, old interviews, facial expressions, tone of voice, body language. Every smile becomes suspicious. Every moment of privacy becomes hiding something. This is where the story shifts from rumor to performance. Because at this stage, it's no longer about what's true. It's about how the audience reacts. And reactions are currency. The more shocking the claim, the more clicks it gets. The more emotional the framing, the longer people stay. The more divisive the discussion, the faster it spreads. Which brings us to a deeply uncomfortable realization. Even if a story like this is completely false, it can still destroy something real. Reputations, relationships, mental health, public trust, and the children at the center of it all, who never chose any of this, become collateral in a game they don't even know exists. So why now? Why didn't this rumor appear years ago? Why not during Harry's exit from royal life? Why not during his memoir release? Why not during the peak of public controversy? Because timing is everything. Right now, public fatigue is high. Trust in institutions is low. Algorithms favor extremes. And audiences are primed for the next bombshell. This isn't accidental. It's structural. We live in an attention economy that rewards emotional whiplash. And few things deliver emotional whiplash faster than a story that attacks family, identity, and legacy all at once. Especially when the subject is someone the public already feels entitled to dissect. But here's the part almost no one stops to consider. If this rumor were true, and again, there is no verified evidence that it is, the way it's being consumed would still be deeply disturbing. Because truth does not require spectacle. And spectacle is exactly what this has become. So before we go any further, before we break down how the rumor started, how it spread, and why so many people believed it, we need to take a breath. We need to step outside the algorithm for just a moment. And we need to ask ourselves one grounding question. Are we witnessing a revelation? Or are we watching the machinery of outrage do what it does best? Because the answer to that question changes everything. And what happens next, how this story evolves, how people respond, and how far speculation is willing to go, may say far more about us than it ever does about Prince Harry. But to understand that, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the moment the rumor appeared, to the account that posted it, to the language it used, and to the psychological trigger it pulled that made millions stop scrolling and start believing. Because once you see how the story was engineered, you'll never look at viral headlines the same way again. Is it the claim itself, or the moment it appears? Because the truth is, thousands of wild rumors surface every single day. Most die quietly. They flicker into existence, get a handful of likes, and disappear into the endless scroll. Forgotten, unseen, unimportant. So why did this one detonate? Why did this particular claim, framed as 5 minutes ago, spread like wildfire while others barely spark? The answer is uncomfortable, and it has almost nothing to do with evidence. It started the way so many viral storms begin now. Not with a news outlet, not with a document, not with a face anyone recognized. Just a post, an account with a generic name, a profile picture that could belong to anyone. No verifiable credentials, no traceable history, no accountability. And yet, within minutes, the words were everywhere. The phrasing was surgical, not messy, not clumsy, carefully constructed to trigger urgency, emotion, and fear all at once. Breaking, just confirmed. DNA results revealed. Each word chosen not to inform, but to override skepticism. And that's the first red flag most people miss. Real revelations unfold slowly. Rumors demand immediate belief. This post didn't ask readers to think. It demanded they react. And react they did. Screenshots began circulating almost instantly. The original post was shared, reshared, then deleted. A classic move that only fueled suspicion. Because in the online world, deletion doesn't signal caution. It signals conspiracy. People asked, why was it taken down? Others answered, because it's true. And just like that, the rumor gained its first layer of armor, perceived suppression. Once a claim feels censored, people stop questioning it. They start defending it. Then came the amplification. YouTube Shorts, TikTok clips, reaction videos, commentary threads, each one adding just a little more drama, a little more certainty, a little more emotional framing. Notice something important here. At no point did anyone introduce new evidence. What spread wasn't information. It was interpretation. One creator speculated about Harry's mental state. Another referenced past interviews. Someone else pulled out old tabloid rumors, dusted them off, and presented them as context. Before long, speculation stacked on speculation until the original claim seemed almost secondary. The story became bigger than its source. And that's when it crossed the line from rumor to narrative. Because narratives don't need proof. They only need cohesion. Suddenly, people weren't asking, is this true? They were asking, how could this have happened? That shift is critical. Once a story moves from verification to explanation, belief has already taken root. Think about how fast that happened. Within hours, comments shifted from confusion to certainty. I always suspected something was off. This explains so much. No wonder Harry looks different lately. Does any of that actually confirm anything? Of course not. But confirmation was never the goal. The goal was emotional validation. People want stories that confirm what they already feel. And for some, this rumor fit neatly into a pre-existing belief that Harry's life is unstable, chaotic, or built on illusion. So the rumor didn't feel random. It felt inevitable. And inevitability is powerful. But here's the contradiction no one wanted to confront. If this claim were real, truly real, it wouldn't break on a faceless account with no history. It wouldn't be framed like clickbait. It wouldn't rely on urgency instead of verification. And yet, that contradiction didn't slow the spread. Why? Because the internet doesn't reward restraint. It rewards whoever speaks first, loudest, and with the most emotional certainty. And this rumor spoke all three languages fluently. Another element pushed it over the edge: timing. It didn't surface during a calm period. It surfaced when audiences were already primed for shock, when royal fatigue was high, when public trust in media was low, when skepticism toward institutions was peaking. People were ready to believe that they were hiding something. And once you believe someone is hiding the truth, any claim that exposes them feels righteous. This is where the rumors stopped being gossip and started feeling like justice. And that's dangerous, because justice implies wrongdoing, and wrongdoing demands judgment. So judgment followed. Online, strangers dissected every public appearance Harry has made in recent months. Clips were slowed down, paused, analyzed. His expressions were labeled, his silences interpreted, his posture psychoanalyzed. Look at his eyes. He seems broken. That's the face of a man who knows. But let's be honest. How many times have you watched a clip and been told what to see before you actually saw it? That's suggestion, not analysis. Once people were told Harry looked devastated, they began to see devastation everywhere. Neutral expressions became grief. Tiredness became despair. Normal human moments became signs. This is confirmation bias in real time. And the algorithm loves it. Because emotional certainty drives engagement. Engagement drives visibility. Visibility drives more belief. It's a loop, a self-feeding machine. And in that machine, nuance dies first. No one wanted to be the person saying, we should wait. No one wanted to say, this might not be real. Because waiting doesn't trend. Doubt doesn't go viral. Outrage does. So the rumor grew teeth. It wasn't enough to say something shocking had happened. People began to speculate about reactions behind closed doors, about conversations that supposedly took place, about emotional breakdowns that no one actually witnessed. Fiction crept in, disguised as insight. And that's when things became truly unmoored. Because once imagined scenes replace verified facts, the story is no longer anchored to reality at all. It becomes a shared hallucination. Ask yourself this. Have you ever seen a rumor so widely discussed that it felt strange to doubt it? That's the effect. Popularity masquerading as proof. And the irony is staggering. The more people repeated, this just broke, the older the rumor became. Recycled, reshaped, and reposted under new thumbnails, new captions, new angles. Nothing new was added, only volume, which raises an unsettling question. If a claim needs to be repeated endlessly to feel real, was it ever solid to begin with? And yet, by the end of the first day, millions had seen some version of the story. Many never saw the original post. They encountered it through reactions, summaries, or emotionally loaded commentary. By then, the framing had hardened. This wasn't presented as a question anymore. It was presented as a moment when everything changed. And moments don't ask permission to exist. They demand attention. But beneath the noise, a quieter reality remained. No verified source. No official statement. No documentation. No corroboration. Just belief. And belief, once ignited, doesn't wait for facts. It builds worlds without them. So how did we get here? How did a single unverified post gain enough momentum to feel like breaking history? The answer lies not just in what was said, but in who was already listening. Because this rumor didn't find a neutral audience. It found an audience already conditioned to expect chaos in Harry's life. An audience accustomed to seeing him as a man constantly unraveling. An audience primed to believe that something, eventually, would go wrong. And when a rumor confirms expectation, it spreads faster than truth ever could. That's not accidental. That's design. But here's the twist no one expected. As the rumor exploded, something else happened quietly in the background. Skeptics began tracing it. And the deeper they looked, the stranger the origin story became. Accounts connected. Timelines overlapped. Patterns emerged. Not proof, but signals. Signals that this wasn't spontaneous. That it wasn't organic. That it may have been engineered to go viral from the start. And once that possibility entered the conversation, everything changed. Because if the rumor was designed, not discovered, then the real story isn't about DNA at all. It's about manipulation. About how easily emotion can be weaponized. About how fast a narrative can be injected into public consciousness and accepted as reality without ever passing through truth. And that brings us to the next question. Who benefits from this story? Who gains clicks, attention, influence, or validation by pushing it? And why Prince Harry again? To answer that, we need to look beyond the rumor itself and examine the psychological groundwork that made it possible. Because this didn't start with a post. It started years ago, with insecurity, with identity, with a man raised under a spotlight that never turned off. And once you understand that, you'll see why this rumor landed exactly where it did, and why it spread exactly the way it did. But to get there, we have to talk about Harry's past. The parts that made him vulnerable to a story like this. And once we do, the entire situation takes on a much darker meaning. What happens when a rumor collides with a lifetime of unresolved questions? Because this story didn't land on a blank slate. It landed on a man whose identity has been questioned publicly since childhood. A man whose place in his own family has been debated, defined, and diminished long before social media ever existed. And that matters. It matters because rumors don't spread in isolation. They latch onto cracks that already exist. They exploit emotional fault lines. They echo doubts that have been whispered for years, sometimes decades. So before anyone asks whether a viral claim makes sense, the more revealing question is this. Why does it feel believable to so many people? To answer that, you have to rewind far past the post, far past the headlines, far past the algorithm. You have to go back to the moment Prince Harry first understood that he was different. Not special, different. From the very beginning, Harry was defined not by who he was, but by who he wasn't. Not the heir, not the future king, not the one with certainty. He was the spare. That word sounds harmless, practical, almost affectionate. But psychologically, it carries weight. Because being the spare means your value is conditional. Your purpose exists only in relation to someone else. And that kind of framing doesn't disappear when you grow up. It embeds itself. Think about it. Every major moment in Harry's life was filtered through comparison. William's responsibility versus Harry's freedom. William's discipline versus Harry's rebellion. William's destiny versus Harry's ambiguity. One was groomed for the crown. The other was left to figure it out. And for a long time, that ambiguity was romanticized. Harry was the fun one, the wild one, the relatable one, the one who could mess up and still be forgiven. And vacuums get filled with speculation. When people can't see you, they imagine you. When they can't hear from you, they narrate you. And when they already believe you're struggling, they imagine the worst. That's how rumors gain emotional traction. Not because they're true, but because they feel plausible within a story people already believe. Now consider the role of betrayal. Harry's relationship with the institution he left is framed by many as a betrayal, either by him or against him, depending on perspective. Betrayal narratives are powerful because they assume deception. If betrayal exists in one area, people assume it exists everywhere. So when a rumor suggests hidden truths, secrets, or shocking revelations, it slots neatly into a betrayal framework. People say, well, if he was lied to about this, what else was he lied to about? And suddenly, everything is up for reinterpretation. Past events are re-examined. Past statements are recontextualized. Innocent moments are viewed through a suspicious lens. That's how history gets rewritten in real time. And once that happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. Because correcting a rumor doesn't just require facts. It requires dismantling an entire emotional narrative. And that's far harder. Here's another uncomfortable truth. The public has been trained to see Harry as perpetually on the brink. Every documentary, every interview, every confession, each one reinforces the image of a man constantly wrestling with himself. And while that may be authentic, it also becomes exploitable. Because when you expect someone to break, any rumor suggesting they did feels like confirmation. But expectation is not evidence, and repetition is not proof. Yet those distinctions vanish when emotion takes over. So when this rumor surfaced, it didn't need to convince people of something new. It only needed to activate something old. Old doubts, old judgments, old narratives. And once activated, those narratives do the rest of the work. They fill in gaps. They supply motives. They invent scenes. Harry's past becomes the justification for believing his present is collapsing. But here's the part most people don't consider. What if the reason this rumor spreads so easily isn't because Harry is unstable, but because the public needs him to be, needs him to fail, needs him to unravel, needs him to confirm a story they've already decided to tell? Because if Harry is okay, truly okay, then a lot of assumptions fall apart. And assumptions are comfortable. So the rumor persists. Not because it's proven, but because it's useful. Useful for engagement. Useful for outrage. Useful for validation. And that leads us to a critical turning point in this story. Because once a rumor stops being about truth and starts being about utility, the damage accelerates. And the next phase of this story shows exactly how that damage spreads. Because the internet didn't just talk about Harry. It turned its attention to the most vulnerable people in the entire situation. The children. And what happened next is where speculation crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Why does lineage fascinate us so deeply? Not achievements, not character, not values. Blood. Because there's something primal about it. Something ancient. Something that predates social media, tabloids, and even modern royalty itself. Bloodlines are stories people tell themselves about legitimacy, about belonging, about who deserves what. And nowhere is that obsession more intense than when royalty is involved. So when a rumor hints at uncertainty around lineage, even hypothetically, it doesn't land as gossip. It lands as heresy. That's why this story escalated so fast. The moment the rumor moved from Prince Harry as an individual to the question of bloodlines, it entered dangerous territory. Because now, it wasn't just about one man's emotional state. It was about legacy. And legacy is where rational thinking tends to disappear. Let's be honest with each other. People don't analyze royal families the way they analyze normal families. They mythologize them. They expect perfection. They demand continuity. They romanticize genetics as destiny. And when something challenges that fantasy, it provokes a reaction that feels disproportionate, but isn't. Because the fantasy itself is fragile. The British monarchy, like all monarchies, rests on a simple idea: inheritance by blood. That idea has been reinforced for centuries through ceremony, tradition, and symbolism. Crowns passed down, names repeated, faces compared across generations. So when the internet begins speculating, not confirming, speculating, about lineage, it taps into centuries of cultural conditioning. This isn't new. Royal history is filled with rumors about heirs, legitimacy, and hidden truths. Long before DNA testing existed, People whispered about resemblance, affairs, swapped babies, and secret arrangements. Back then, rumors spread through word of mouth. Now they spread through algorithms, and algorithms are far more efficient. So when this rumor surfaced, it didn't feel like an isolated event. It felt like the latest chapter in a very old story. People immediately started doing what they've been trained to do. Compare. Photos side by side. Facial features analyzed. Expressions scrutinized. Who does the child look like? Who don't they look like? What does that mean? These questions spread rapidly, not because they were logical, but because they felt familiar. We've seen this before. Public figures' children have always been subject to cruel speculation. But when royalty is involved, the scrutiny intensifies. Because people believe lineage equals legitimacy, and legitimacy equals power. Even if that belief no longer holds legal weight, it holds emotional power. Now pause for a second and ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why do strangers feel entitled to dissect children they have never met? Why does the internet feel comfortable turning private lives into public puzzles? The answer isn't curiosity. It's projection. People project their beliefs, biases, and resentments onto symbols. And royal children are symbols before they're human beings. That's where the obsession becomes dangerous. Because once children become symbols, empathy gets replaced by entitlement. The rumor didn't need proof to activate this obsession. It only needed implication. Once implication was present, the machinery kicked in. Commentators framed their analysis as just asking questions. Creators insisted they were being objective. Viewers claimed they were only discussing what's already out there. But let's be clear. Questioning without evidence isn't neutrality. It's amplification. And amplification is how speculation becomes harm. Here's another layer people don't like to confront. Race. Whenever royal lineage discussions involve children who don't fit traditional expectations shaped by centuries of homogeneity, the scrutiny intensifies. Consciously or unconsciously, people begin searching for differences, not similarities. Differences. And differences get interpreted as discrepancies. Discrepancies get interpreted as suspicion. Suspicion gets interpreted as justification. This isn't always explicit. Often it's subtle, disguised as analysis, framed as curiosity, but it's there. And once it enters the conversation, the tone changes. Suddenly, speculation feels emboldened. People who would never question the lineage of one royal child feel comfortable questioning another. And the internet, once again, rewards the loudest voices. What's especially disturbing is how quickly this obsession detached from reality. No one involved had access to any real information. No documentation. No statements. No confirmation. And yet, people spoke with confidence. They declared conclusions. They filled in gaps with imagination. And imagination, when repeated often enough, begins to feel like memory. This is how misinformation evolves. Not through lies alone, but through collective storytelling. Everyone adds a detail. Everyone contributes a theory. Everyone shapes the narrative. And soon, the original rumor barely matters. The story has taken on a life of its own. Now think about how that impacts the person at the center of it. Prince Harry isn't just watching strangers speculate about his life. He's watching them speculate about his children. Children he has gone to extraordinary lengths to protect from public scrutiny. Children he removed himself from an entire institution to safeguard. So when people casually debate their lineage, it strikes at the very core of his motivation. And that's where the emotional stakes skyrocket. Because this isn't abstract. It's personal. And here's the cruel contradiction. The more Harry tries to protect his children by staying silent, the more that silence gets interpreted as secrecy, which feeds the rumor. So he's trapped. Speak out and fuel the fire. Stay silent and let speculation grow. This is the paradox of modern public life. Silence used to mean dignity. Now it's treated as evidence. And the obsession with bloodlines makes that paradox unbearable. Because people feel justified in their curiosity. They tell themselves they're discussing history, or tradition, or public interest. But strip away the rhetoric, and what's left? Intrusion. Now let's talk about escalation. Because once the internet fixates on lineage, it doesn't stop at curiosity. It moves toward judgment. If lineage is questioned, legitimacy is questioned. If legitimacy is questioned, belonging is questioned. And once belonging is questioned, exclusion isn't far behind. That's when language shifts. From what if to this explains why to they never should have. Each step feels small. Each step feels reasonable to the person taking it. But together, they form a pattern of dehumanization. Children become evidence. Parents become suspects. Families become case studies. All without consent, and all without proof. This is where the story takes on a darker tone. Because even if the rumor is completely false, and there is no verified evidence supporting it, the damage inflicted by speculation is real. Psychological damage, reputational damage, cultural damage. It reinforces the idea that some families are more legitimate than others, that some children must prove their worth through appearance or lineage. And that idea doesn't stay confined to royalty. It trickles down. It normalizes scrutiny of private lives. It teaches people that intimacy is public property, and that's a cost no algorithm accounts for. Here's something else worth considering. Why do people who claim to distrust institutions so deeply suddenly become obsessed with preserving royal purity? Why does skepticism disappear when it comes to bloodlines? Because contradiction lives at the heart of outrage culture. People don't want truth. They want coherence. They want stories that make sense emotionally, even if they don't logically. And bloodline narratives provide that coherence. They simplify complex lives into neat explanations. He belongs. He doesn't. This fits. This doesn't. Reality, of course, is messy. Families are complicated. Identities are layered. Love is not genetic. But messiness doesn't trend. Certainty does. And that's why this chapter of the story is so unsettling. Because once the obsession with bloodlines took hold, the rumor no longer needed to be about Prince Harry at all. It became about enforcing boundaries, about deciding who counts. And when strangers feel empowered to decide who counts, something has gone very wrong. Which brings us to the next stage of this unfolding saga. Because as speculation intensified, something else happened. The conversation shifted away from abstract analysis and towards something far more invasive. People began staging judgment, not just discussing, judging. And the internet transformed itself into something chillingly familiar. A courtroom, with no rules, no evidence standards, no defense. Just accusation, repetition, and verdicts delivered in comment sections. And once that happened, the story crossed into territory that can't be undone. Because the internet doesn't forget its verdicts. And what happened next shows exactly how fast speculation turns into conviction. When does discussion stop being discussion? And when does it quietly turn into judgment? Because somewhere along the way, this story stopped being about a rumor circulating online and started becoming something far more dangerous. A trial conducted in public, with no rules, no standards, and no right of reply. Ask yourself this. At what point did scrolling through comments begin to feel like reading verdicts? It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened in stages. First came curiosity, then analysis, then speculation, and then accusation. That's the moment everything shifted. Because once accusation enters the conversation, the tone hardens, the language sharpens, and the audience unconsciously assigns roles. Victim, suspect, witness, judge. Social media doesn't just host these roles. It distributes them. Anyone with a comment box becomes a prosecutor. Anyone with a following becomes an expert witness. Anyone who disagrees becomes suspicious. And Prince Harry, whether he participated or not, was placed at the center of the courtroom, not as a person, but as a case. Look at how quickly language changed. Early posts asked questions. Later posts made statements. Soon after, statements became assumptions. And assumptions became conclusions. I think something's off turned into this explains everything. What if turned into obviously? Could it be turned into it is? That evolution is subtle, but it's everything. Because once conclusions are reached emotionally, evidence becomes optional. Now here's the part most people don't notice while it's happening. Social media doesn't encourage people to be right. It encourages people to be first. And in that race, certainty beats accuracy every time. Creators who hesitated were drowned out by those who spoke boldly. Measured voices were eclipsed by confident declarations. Nuance didn't survive the algorithm. Because nuance doesn't provoke. Judgment does. So timelines filled with reaction videos, stitched clips, dramatic thumbnails, and captions framed like closing arguments. This changes everything. We were lied to. The truth always comes out. None of these statements require proof. They only require belief. And belief spreads faster when it feels collective. That's another crucial element of the courtroom effect. People rarely want to be alone in their skepticism, but they feel safer joining a crowd that appears convinced. So once enough voices speak with certainty, doubt feels risky. Disagreeing becomes uncomfortable. Questioning feels naive. Waiting feels pointless. And suddenly, the burden shifts. Instead of asking those making the claim to prove it, people demand that others disprove it. That's how the presumption of innocence collapses. In a real courtroom, the standard is evidence. Online, the standard is momentum. And momentum was accelerating fast. Watch how creators framed their content. They didn't say, "Here's what we know." They said, "Here's what this means." Meaning replaced fact. Interpretation replaced verification. And interpretation, when repeated enough times, begins to feel like reality. Another thing happened at the same time. People began policing emotion. Harry's supposed reactions were dissected and judged, not based on actual statements, but on imagined responses. If it were me, I'd be furious. If this were true, he'd look devastated. If he hasn't denied it, that tells you everything. This is one of the most insidious tricks of online judgment. People assume that emotional responses must follow a script. If someone doesn't react the way the crowd expects, that deviation becomes evidence. Silence becomes guilt. Calm becomes deception. Privacy becomes secrecy. There is no acceptable response once the courtroom is active. Every option is interpreted against you. And remember, this entire judgment is happening without confirmed facts. That's what makes it so dangerous. Now consider how quickly humor entered the mix. Memes, sarcastic captions, jokes framed as commentary. Humor acts like social permission. Once something becomes a joke, people feel justified engaging with it casually. It lowers the emotional barrier. But jokes also desensitize. They turn serious implications into entertainment. And when entertainment becomes the primary mode of engagement, empathy erodes. Children become punchlines. Families become content. Trauma becomes a punchy hook. And the courtroom turns into a theater. Audience applause replaces deliberation. Likes replace evidence. Shares replace scrutiny. Another subtle shift happened too. Creators began referencing each other. This creator pointed out, as others have noticed. People are saying, this creates the illusion of consensus. Not because experts agree, but because repetition mimics authority. Once enough people repeat the same talking points, the source stops matching. The story feels validated simply because it's everywhere. And that's when the verdict starts to feel inevitable. Even those who are uncomfortable with the narrative begin hedging. I'm not saying it's true, but I don't want to speculate, however. I'm just asking questions. These disclaimers don't slow the spread. They accelerate it. Because they allow people to participate while feeling morally insulated. They get to engage without taking responsibility. And responsibility is the first casualty of viral judgment. Now ask yourself this. If this were happening to someone you know, a coworker, a neighbor, a friend, would this level of speculation feel acceptable? Would you accept strangers analyzing their children, their marriage, their private life, based on an anonymous claim? Or does it only feel acceptable because the subject is famous? That's another contradiction. People insist they distrust elites, yet they feel entitled to their lives. They resent power, but consume it obsessively. And in that consumption, boundaries disappear. The courtroom doesn't care about proportionality. It doesn't ask whether the punishment fits the crime. It doesn't even require a crime. It only requires a story compelling enough to sustain outrage. And this story was perfectly engineered for that. It involved secrecy, identity, family, children, legacy. Each element adds emotional gravity. Stack them together, and the crowd doesn't just watch. It judges. Here's where things become especially chilling. Once judgment hardens, people begin rewriting the past to support it. Old interviews are reframed. Past jokes are reinterpreted. Neutral statements are read as clues. History becomes retroactively suspicious. And once that happens, exoneration becomes almost impossible. Because how do you disprove an interpretation? How do you undo a feeling? You can present facts, if any even exist, but facts don't erase emotional narratives. They compete with them, and emotional narratives usually win. Another element fuels the courtroom dynamic: parasocial confidence. People feel like they know Harry. They've watched him grow up. They've seen interviews. They've read books. They've followed headlines for decades. That familiarity creates a false sense of intimacy. And intimacy creates entitlement. People speak as if they're commenting on a character they've followed for years, not a real person. There were always questions. Questions, in this context, aren't requests for information. They're statements in disguise. And statements repeated enough times become assumptions. Assumptions repeated enough times become accepted truth. This is how a person becomes a suspect without ever being accused directly. The internet doesn't need to say, "She did something." It only needs to imply, "There's something there." And once implication takes root, imagination fills in the rest. What makes this especially disturbing is how little the conversation relied on anything real. No new facts emerged. No verified claims surfaced. No first-hand accounts appeared. Yet the speculation grew more confident by the hour. Because confidence, online, doesn't come from accuracy. It comes from alignment. The more a claim aligns with existing bias, the more confidently it's repeated. And Meghan has long been a lightning rod for bias. That's not an opinion. It's observable. Her every action has been scrutinized, interpreted, and reinterpreted through competing narratives. One side sees resilience and self-protection. The other sees manipulation and control. And when a rumor like this appears, those narratives don't pause. They accelerate. Another layer complicated things even further. Misogyny. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge, but impossible to ignore. When men are at the center of scandal, their actions are debated. When women are pulled into the orbit, their character is interrogated. Intent becomes the focus. Motivation becomes suspect. Personality becomes evidence. So instead of asking whether the rumor itself made sense, portions of the internet pivoted to a different question entirely. What kind of woman would allow this? That question reveals more about the questioner than the subject, because it assumes wrongdoing without proof. It assumes knowledge without access. And it assumes entitlement to answers that no stranger is owed. But once again, the courtroom dynamic applies. The crowd doesn't need facts. It needs a defendant. And Meghan, already familiar to public judgment, became that defendant by default. Now consider the psychological pressure of this moment. Imagine knowing that a rumor you didn't create, didn't confirm, and didn't address is being used to question your integrity as a parent. Imagine knowing that millions of strangers feel comfortable debating your children's existence as if it's a puzzle for them to solve. That's not just invasive. It's destabilizing. And yet, online, that human reality gets flattened. People talk about optics. They analyze PR strategy. They speculate about control, as if this were a corporate scandal, as if real children weren't involved, as if emotional harm were theoretical. This flattening is part of the problem. It turns lived experience into content. And once something becomes content, empathy is optional. Here's another contradiction worth sitting with. Many of the same people who criticize the monarchy for being cold, distant, and dehumanizing engage in speculation that does the exact same thing. They condemn institutions for lacking compassion, while stripping compassion from individuals. And because Meghan exists outside traditional royal archetypes, she becomes an easy target. Outsiders are always easier to blame. They're not protected by nostalgia. They're not shielded by tradition. They don't benefit from generational familiarity. So suspicion sticks. And once suspicion sticks, everything gets filtered through it. Silence becomes strategy. Privacy becomes secrecy. Boundaries become guilt. There is no neutral behavior once someone is framed as deceptive. This is why the conversation around Meghan escalated so quickly, not because of new information, but because the narrative machinery was already built. All it needed was activation. Another unsettling pattern emerged as this shift occurred. People began retrofitting the rumor into unrelated grievances. Past interviews were dragged back into the conversation. Old tabloid claims resurfaced. Disputes with the press were reframed as evidence of manipulation. None of these things had anything to do with the original claim. But relevance wasn't required. Only association. This is how narratives expand beyond their origin. They absorb whatever material supports them. And soon, the story wasn't just about a rumor. It was about character. And character, once questioned publicly, becomes almost impossible to defend. Because character isn't provable, it's perceived, which brings us to a critical realization. The internet didn't need Meghan to do anything. It needed her to exist. Her presence alone was enough to satisfy the crowd's demand for explanation. Because explanations reduce discomfort, they give chaos a shape, and chaos is deeply uncomfortable. So people latched onto the most convenient explanation available, not the most accurate, the most emotionally satisfying. Now ask yourself this. If the rumor had involved a less polarizing figure, would it have spread the same way? If the family dynamic fit traditional expectations more neatly, would speculation have escalated as aggressively? Or does this story thrive precisely because it reinforces existing divisions? That question matters, because it exposes the role the audience plays. The internet didn't just observe this rumor. It participated in shaping it. And in doing so, it amplified harm far beyond the original claim. Here's the part that's hardest to accept. Even if the rumor disappears tomorrow, even if it's thoroughly debunked, the association won't fully disappear. Search results linger. Comment threads remain. Memory holds on to impressions. That's the lasting impact of being pulled into a narrative like this. And Meghan has been pulled into many. Which raises a sobering point. At what stage does repeated speculation become harassment? At what point does public interest cross into public harm? Those lines are blurry online, but the consequences are real. Because while the internet moves on quickly, the people at the center don't get that luxury. They live with the residue, the stress, the anxiety, the knowledge that strangers feel entitled to judge their most private roles. And that stress doesn't exist in isolation. It compounds. It feeds into relationships, into parenting, into mental health. Which brings us back to Prince Harry. Because while the spotlight shifted toward Meghan, it didn't move away from him. Instead, it reframed him. No longer just a subject of rumor, but a figure caught between narratives. A husband presumed either complicit or deceived. A father presumed either unaware or betrayed. A man whose agency was questioned from all sides. And that reframing set the stage for the next phase of this story. Because once both parents were under scrutiny, the speculation intensified. People began asking not just what happened, but how Harry must be reacting, what he must be feeling, what he must be going through behind closed doors. And those imagined reactions became the next fuel source for the rumor. Because if there's one thing the internet loves more than secrets, it's emotional collapse. And what came next pushed the narrative even further away from reality and closer to something deeply unsettling. What happens when a rumor isn't judged by facts, but by how people imagine someone must be reacting to it? Because that's where this story pivoted. Not on evidence, not on confirmation, not on anything tangible. It pivoted on emotion, or more accurately, imagined emotion. Once speculation had pulled Meghan into the spotlight, attention swung back to Prince Harry with renewed intensity. But this time, the focus wasn't on what happened. It was on how he must be handling it. And that distinction changed everything. Think about how quickly the narrative shifted. The rumor itself became background noise. The reaction became the headline. People stopped asking, "Is this true?" They started asking, "Can you imagine how Harry feels?" That question feels empathetic on the surface. But look closer. It assumes the premise is real. It skips verification and jumps straight to emotional consequence. And once you do that, you've already accepted the story. That's why reaction-based narratives are so powerful. They don't need proof. They need imagination. And imagination, when guided by bias, fills in gaps with drama. Online, creators began painting vivid emotional scenes. Harry alone. Harry devastated. Harry questioning everything. Harry breaking down. None of these scenes were witnessed. None were confirmed. But they felt believable to an audience already primed to see Harry as emotionally fragile. And belief was enough. Here's the uncomfortable truth. People often feel closer to someone's pain than to their reality. Pain feels accessible. Reality requires patience. So when creators speculated about Harry's internal state, viewers leaned in. Because emotional collapse is compelling. It's human. It's dramatic. It feels intimate. And intimacy drives engagement. But there's a contradiction hiding here. If Harry has demonstrated anything consistently over the years, it's emotional resilience. Not perfection. Not stability in the traditional sense. But endurance. He has endured grief that was public and relentless. He has endured criticism that never seems to end. He has endured the loss of institutional belonging and the rebuilding of identity from scratch. Those aren't the experiences of someone who shatters easily. And yet, the narrative insists on fragility. Why? Because fragility fits the story better than strength. Strength complicates the rumor. Fragility validates it. So the internet chose fragility. Creators dissected Harry's recent appearances. Old clips resurfaced. Every expression became symbolic. A pause was read as shock. A neutral face was read as devastation. A lack of response was read as silence of guilt. This is projection in its purest form. People weren't observing Harry. They were projecting a script onto him. And once a script exists, every detail becomes evidence. Even absence, silence, in particular, became the centerpiece of speculation. Why hasn't he said anything? If it were false, he'd deny it. His silence says everything. These statements reveal a deep misunderstanding of how public figures operate and how humans cope. Silence can mean many things. Legal caution, emotional exhaustion, protection of children, refusal to legitimize nonsense. But the courtroom doesn't allow for multiple interpretations. It prefers one: guilt or devastation. Either way, silence is never neutral. Now pause and ask yourself something. If someone accused you of something deeply personal and untrue, how would you respond? Would you rush to address it publicly? Would you dignify it with a statement? Would you risk amplifying it by responding? Or would you retreat? There's no universal answer. Yet the internet treats silence as a universal confession. And that's not accidental. Because silence creates space. And space invites speculation. Speculation fills the void faster than facts ever could. Another layer added fuel to the fire. People began comparing Harry's imagined reaction to how they believed other royals would react. William would be furious. Charles would intervene. The palace would respond. These comparisons assume something critical: that Harry operates under the same emotional and institutional rules as those who remained. He doesn't. He stepped away from the machinery that manages narratives. He doesn't have the same incentives to respond. He doesn't benefit from the same silent strategies. And yet, the audience judged him as if he did. This mismatch created frustration. And frustration turned into suspicion. Because when someone doesn't behave the way you expect, it feels wrong. Even if your expectations are flawed. That's another psychological trap. Expectation becomes entitlement. And entitlement becomes accusation. As speculation intensified, people began crafting elaborate emotional arcs. The moment Harry allegedly found out, the alleged confrontation, the imagined aftermath, these weren't presented as fiction. They were presented as insight. As a father, he must have. As a husband, he likely. Knowing Harry, this would have. These phrases are subtle, but powerful. They anchor imagination to perceived familiarity. And perceived familiarity creates confidence. Confidence creates conviction. Conviction creates belief. But belief without evidence is just a story. And this story was being written collaboratively by millions of strangers. Another disturbing element emerged. People began ranking pain. Some argued Harry deserved sympathy. Others argued he brought this on himself. Some claimed this was karma. Others claimed it was tragedy. Pain became a moral battleground. And once pain becomes moralized, empathy fractures. Because if someone is judged to deserve pain, concern evaporates. That's when cruelty feels justified. Jokes resurfaced. Dismissive comments multiplied. Sarcasm replaced compassion. Harry's imagined devastation became entertainment. Which raises a grim question. Why are people so comfortable consuming imagined suffering? Because it's safe. It doesn't require action. It doesn't demand responsibility. It allows people to feel something without having to do anything. And social media rewards feeling, not doing. As this reaction-driven narrative grew, something else happened. The rumor itself became almost irrelevant. People weren't discussing DNA. They were discussing breakdowns. They weren't debating truth. They were debating impact. And impact doesn't require accuracy. It only requires belief. Now consider the psychological weight of being turned into a character. Harry wasn't being seen as a man navigating a complex situation. He was being cast in a role. The broken prince. The betrayed husband. The shattered father. Roles are rigid. They don't allow for nuance. And once someone is cast, every future action is interpreted through that lens. Smile? He's faking it. Stay quiet? He's hiding pain. Speak out. He's unraveling. There is no winning script. This is the trap of reaction-based storytelling. It removes agency. It denies complexity. It turns human beings into plot devices. And the internet loves plot devices because they're easy to understand. Another contradiction deepened the damage. Many of the same people who insist on protecting children from public harm engaged enthusiastically in narratives that centered children as the source of a parent's pain. That contradiction didn't slow engagement. It fueled it, because outrage thrives on hypocrisy, and the algorithm doesn't penalize inconsistency. It amplifies emotion. At this point, the story had transformed completely. It was no longer about whether something happened. It was about how devastating it must have been. And that framing is almost impossible to dismantle. Because even if the premise is false, the emotional narrative feels real. People say, even if it's not true, imagine how hard this must be. But that, even if, does important work. It keeps the story alive regardless of truth. It ensures the rumor never fully dies. And that's the genius. And the danger of emotional framing. It makes verification irrelevant, which leads to the next phase of this unfolding saga. Because once emotion replaces evidence, the conversation shifts again. From reaction to implication. People begin asking what this means for the future, for relationships, for family dynamics, for royal tensions. Speculation about emotional collapse gives way to speculation about consequences. And once consequences are imagined, the story gains momentum all over again. Because consequences feel substantial, they feel forward-moving. And what people imagine next raised the stakes even higher. Because the implications weren't just personal. They were political, institutional, explosive. And to understand how quickly imagination ran ahead of reality, we need to examine what people began predicting next and why those predictions spread so fast. Because once the internet starts forecasting fallout, it rarely stops. And what came next made the rumor feel unstoppable. What do people really think a DNA test does? Because once the conversation shifted from imagined reactions to imagined consequences, a new assumption quietly took over the narrative, that a single test could rewrite identity, family, and legitimacy in one devastating moment. That assumption is powerful, and it's wrong. But online, it didn't matter. Because the idea of a DNA test carries symbolic weight far beyond its actual function. It feels final, scientific, undeniable. People treat it like a truth machine, a switch that flips uncertainty into certainty. So when the rumor invoked DNA, it didn't just add drama. It added authority. And authority shuts down skepticism. Ask yourself this. How often have you heard someone say, DNA doesn't lie? That phrase gets repeated so often it feels absolute. But reality is far more complicated. DNA can answer specific biological questions. It cannot answer emotional ones. It cannot define love. It cannot dictate belonging. It cannot measure parenthood in any meaningful human sense. Yet the internet collapsed all of those distinctions into one imagined moment of revelation. A test, a result, a breakdown. Clean, simple, cinematic. But life doesn't work that way. And that disconnect between reality and expectation is where this story became especially distorted. Let's slow this down. First, legality. Even in hypothetical scenarios, DNA results do not automatically alter legal parenthood. Laws recognize intent, caregiving, and established relationships. Parenthood isn't undone by a piece of paper or a lab report. But the internet didn't discuss law. It discussed shock. It discussed humiliation. It discussed what should happen, not what would. Because should is emotional. Would is technical. And technical details kill drama. So they were ignored. Instead, people spoke as if a test could erase years of parenting overnight. As if bonds could dissolve instantly. As if children could become strangers because of a biological detail. That belief reveals something unsettling. It reveals how deeply people equate biology with legitimacy. And that equation is neither universal nor humane. Now let's talk about the emotional dimension, because this is where speculation spiraled the most. People began imagining what it would feel like to discover something about your family that challenged your assumptions. They described devastation. They described betrayal. They described identity collapse. Again, imagined. But the emotional language was vivid. And vivid emotion feels real. Here's the contradiction. The same people who insist that love makes a family often abandon that belief the moment biology is introduced. Suddenly, genetics become destiny. Suddenly, caregiving becomes conditional. Suddenly, years of lived experience are treated as provisional. Why? Because biology feels objective. It feels safe. It feels indisputable. And in a world overwhelmed by uncertainty, people cling to anything that feels concrete, even if it's misunderstood. So the rumor didn't just introduce DNA as a fact. It introduced DNA as a moral authority. And once that happens, the conversation narrows. Everything becomes binary. True or false. Real or fake. Belonging or exclusion. That binary thinking fueled extreme conclusions. People speculated about custody.